Scary telling.
I remember the day the virus first appeared in our town. It was a warm summer afternoon, and I was walking home from the grocery store when I saw the first victim. He was a man in his mid-30s, walking down the street with a huge smile on his face. It looked like his cheeks were going to split in two. I remember feeling a shiver run down my spine as I watched him pass by. Over the next few days, more and more people began to show symptoms of the strange smiling disease. At first, it seemed like a minor annoyance, a weird quirk that some people had picked up. But as the smiles grew wider and more grotesque, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. The local authorities tried to contain the outbreak, but they were woefully unprepared for what was happening. They set up checkpoints around the town, hoping to prevent the virus from spreading. But it was already too late. People began to barricade themselves in their homes, too afraid to venture outside. I remember looking out my window and seeing the deserted streets, the empty playgrounds and parks. It was like a ghost town. As the days went by, the virus continued to spread. More and more people were infected, and their smiles became more and more twisted. It was like their faces were frozen in a permanent, grotesque grin. I tried to avoid contact with anyone who looked infected, but it seemed like the virus was everywhere. I remember walking down the street and seeing a woman smiling so wide that her eyes were bulging out of her head. It was like something out of a nightmare. The military was called in to try and stop the virus from spreading, and they established a quarantine zone around the town. But it was too late. The virus had already spread beyond our borders, infecting people across the country. Looking back, I can't believe how quickly it all happened. One day everything was normal, and the next day the world had changed forever. The memory of those twisted, grotesque smiles still haunts me to this day. The military had set up checkpoints around the town to contain the outbreak. They were heavily armed and looked like they meant business. The soldiers didn't say much, but you could see the fear in their eyes. They knew they were dealing with something they had never seen before. As the days went by, the number of infected people grew exponentially. People were dying in their homes, and there was nothing anyone could do to help them. The virus was spreading rapidly, and it seemed like everyone was a potential carrier. The townspeople were starting to panic. We knew that something had to be done, but we didn't know what. People began to hoard food and water, and the stores quickly ran out of supplies. It was like a war zone. I remember seeing people on the streets, wandering aimlessly with those twisted, grotesque smiles on their faces. They looked like they were in a trance, and nothing could snap them out of it. It was like the virus had taken over their minds. The military's efforts to contain the outbreak only made things worse. They tried to round up the infected and put them in makeshift quarantine zones, but it was clear that they were struggling to deal with the situation. Some of the infected had become violent and unpredictable, attacking anyone who crossed their path. The military soon lost control of the situation, and the town descended into chaos. People were breaking into stores and houses, looking for supplies. The streets were filled with the sounds of screams and gunshots. It was like the apocalypse had come. I knew that I had to get out of the town if I wanted to survive. I packed a bag with some essentials and set out on foot. The journey was dangerous, but I had no choice. I had to get as far away from the infected as possible. As I walked, I saw scenes that I will never forget. I saw infected people attacking others, tearing them apart with their bare hands. I saw bodies lying in the streets, their faces frozen in that twisted, grotesque smile. It was like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Finally, I reached the outskirts of the town. I looked back at the chaos that I had left behind, and I knew that I was lucky to have escaped. But even as I walked away, I knew that the virus was spreading and that the world would never be the same. After I escaped the town, I kept walking for days, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the virus. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the memories of what I had seen. The infected people with their twisted, grotesque smiles haunted me day and night. It wasn't until I heard news reports that I learned that the virus had mutated. The people who were infected had become even more dangerous and unpredictable. Some of them had developed an insatiable hunger for human flesh, attacking anyone who crossed their path. The news reports were filled with stories of violence and carnage. People were being torn apart by the infected, and there seemed to be no way to stop them. The military was called in, but they were powerless to contain the outbreak. The scientists were working frantically to find a cure, but it seemed like the virus was always one step ahead of them. Every time they thought they had found a way to stop it, the virus mutated again, becoming even more dangerous than before. I remember hearing stories of people with strange new abilities. Some of them could run faster than any human, while others could jump incredible distances. It was like the virus had given them superhuman powers. The infected people were everywhere now, and it seemed like no one was safe. I had to be constantly on guard, always looking over my shoulder for any signs of danger. The military had set up a quarantine zone around the town, but it quickly became clear that it wasn't enough. The infected had spread beyond the town's borders, infecting people across the country. I remember seeing news reports of cities under siege by the infected. The military was called in to try and stop them, but it seemed like they were fighting a losing battle. The infected were too strong, too fast, too unpredictable. The scientists were working around the clock to develop a cure, but it was like trying to catch smoke in their hands. Every time they thought they had a lead, the virus mutated again, rendering their work useless. I knew that the world would never be the same again. The virus had changed everything, and there was no going back. I had to learn to adapt to this new reality, to survive in a world where the infected roamed freely. As I looked out at the world, I wondered how long it would be before the virus reached me. How long before I became one of the infected, with that twisted, grotesque smile on my face? I knew that I had to be strong, that I had to fight to survive. But deep down, I knew that the odds were against me. As the virus continued to spread across the country, the government established a quarantine zone around the infected area, trapping the infected inside. Those outside the zone watched in horror as the situation inside deteriorated. I was one of the lucky ones. I had managed to escape the infected area before the quarantine was established. But I knew that others weren't so lucky. Friends, family, and loved ones were trapped inside, facing a grim fate. I watched news reports of the military struggling to maintain control of the quarantine zone. The infected had mutated again, becoming even more dangerous than before. They were faster, stronger, and more unpredictable. The military had set up checkpoints around the perimeter of the quarantine zone, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a sieve. The infected were getting out, and there seemed to be no way to stop them. Those of us outside the quarantine zone watched in horror as the situation deteriorated. The infected were attacking anyone who crossed their path, tearing them apart with their bare hands. It was like a scene from a horror movie. I knew that I had to do something to help. I joined a group of survivors who were trying to find a way into the quarantine zone to rescue those trapped inside. We knew that it was dangerous, but we were willing to risk our lives to save others. We made our way to the perimeter of the quarantine zone, where we were met by heavily armed soldiers. They told us that it was too dangerous to go inside, that we would be risking our lives for nothing. But we refused to back down. We had to try. We knew that there were people inside who needed our help, and we couldn't just sit back and do nothing. We made our way inside, dodging infected people as we went. It was like walking through a minefield. One wrong move, and we would be torn apart. We finally reached the center of the quarantine zone, where we found a group of survivors huddled together, trying to stay alive. They looked at us with a mixture of relief and fear. We told them that we were there to help, that we would get them out. But it wasn't going to be easy. The infected were everywhere, and we knew that we were in for a fight. We made our way back to the perimeter of the quarantine zone, fighting off infected people as we went. It was like a scene from a war movie, with bullets flying and blood splattering everywhere. But we made it out. We managed to rescue the survivors and get them to safety. It was like a small victory in a war that we were losing. As we looked back at the quarantine zone, we knew that we had done what we could. But we also knew that there were still people trapped inside, still fighting for their lives. We vowed to keep fighting, to never give up, no matter how grim the situation seemed. After the failed attempt to rescue those trapped inside the quarantine zone, our group of survivors had to come up with a new plan. We knew that the infected were everywhere, and that we had to be constantly on guard if we wanted to survive. We found a safe house where we could regroup and plan our next move. It was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, far away from the infected areas. We fortified it as best as we could, knowing that it would be our home for the foreseeable future. We had to learn to adapt to this new reality, to find ways to survive in a world where the infected roamed freely. We set up patrols around the warehouse, keeping an eye out for any signs of danger. We also had to learn to scavenge for supplies. We knew that we couldn't stay in the warehouse forever, and that we would eventually run out of food and water. So we ventured out into the world, looking for anything that could help us survive. It was dangerous out there. The infected were everywhere, and we had to be constantly on guard. We had to learn to move quietly and quickly, avoiding any signs of danger. But we were determined to survive. We knew that we couldn't give up, that we had to keep fighting, no matter how hopeless the situation seemed. We found other survivors along the way, forming alliances and working together to survive. We shared information, supplies, and strategies, knowing that we were all in this together. But there were losses along the way. We lost people to the infected, to starvation, and to disease. It was like a constant battle, one that we could never let our guard down for. As time went by, we began to see signs of hope. The scientists were making progress in finding a cure, and it seemed like there was a light at the end of the tunnel. But we also knew that we couldn't rely on the scientists to save us. We had to take matters into our own hands, to fight for our survival, no matter what. And so we continued to fight. We continued to scavenge for supplies, to fortify our safe house, and to look for ways to defeat the infected. It wasn't easy, but we never gave up. We knew that our survival depended on it. And as long as we were still breathing, we would keep fighting.